Poor girl with brother in her arms in front of the grocery store begs the billionaire. He just needs a little milk. I promise to pay you back when I grow up. What he does next is unbelievable. Adrian Blake's footsteps echoed across the marble floor of the corporate building. His impeccable, custom-tailored suit didn't show a single wrinkle despite the exhausting day. While other executives left the building with expressions of relief, Adrian maintained an impassive countenance, as if the 6-hour meeting hadn't drained his energy at all. "See you tomorrow, Blake," said Johnson, one of the directors, trying to start a casual conversation. Adrian just nodded. Not out of rudeness, but because he had learned long ago that saving words meant saving time, and time was money. The sky was beginning to darken when he stepped out onto the street. A cold breeze blew between the skyscrapers, heralding the arrival of fall in Chicago. Adrian adjusted his coat and checked his watch. 10 minutes to 7. Normally, his driver would be waiting, but today he had dismissed the service. Something inside him called for a walk, a moment alone before returning to the silent mansion he called home. The city lights were beginning to turn on, creating a golden glow that contrasted with the growing shadows. Adrian decided to take a shortcut past the small corner market. Maybe he'd buy something to eat, although he knew he probably wouldn't have an appetite by the time he got home. That's when his eyes caught something unusual on the sidewalk near the market's entrance. A small girl, who couldn't have been more than 5, was sitting on a concrete step. Her brown hair fell in messy waves over her shoulders, and her dress, though clean, showed signs of long-term wear. But what really caught Adrian's attention was what she was holding, a baby wrapped in a faded blue blanket. Adrian slowed his pace, intrigued. The normal thing to do would be to keep walking. Other people's problems were not his responsibility. That's what he had always done, after all. But there was something about that scene that stopped him from simply ignoring it. The girl looked up as he approached. Her large brown eyes had a seriousness that didn't belong to a child her age. Adrian could see the tear stains on her cheeks, but she wasn't crying now. She looked determined, like an adult facing a complex problem. "Mister," she called out, her voice surprisingly firm for someone so small. Adrian stopped, hesitant. He wasn't used to interacting with children. In his 42 years, he had built a business empire, closed million-dollar deals, and faced ruthless competitors, but he never knew how to talk to a child. "Yes," he replied, keeping a safe distance. The girl hugged the baby tighter to her chest before speaking again. "He just needs a little milk." Her voice broke for a moment, but she swallowed hard and continued. "I promise to pay you back when I grow up." Those simple words hit Adrian like a punch to the gut. He, who was never shaken by anything, felt something strange stir in his chest. It wasn't pity. Adrian hated feeling pity. It was something deeper, more unsettling. The baby in the girl's arms stirred, making a small noise. He wasn't crying, just making weak sounds, as if he had already given up on protesting. "Where's your mother?" Adrian asked, looking around, hoping to see an adult approaching. "She's waiting," the girl answered, and without elaborating. "I told her I would get milk for Tommy." Adrian took a deep breath. The city was full of scammers, adults who used children to elicit sympathy and get money, but something in that little girl's eyes didn't seem rehearsed. There was a dignity in those small eyes, a strength that intrigued him. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching down a bit to get closer to her level. "Emily," she replied, adjusting the baby in her lap. "And this is Tommy. He's hungry." Adrian noticed the girl's hands, too small for the responsibility they carried. He saw how she protected her brother, as if she were the only barrier between him and the world. Without planning, without thinking about the consequences, Adrian extended his hand to her. "Come with me," he said, in a tone that surprised even himself with its gentleness. Emily hesitated, looking at his outstretched hand, and then at Adrian's face. In that brief moment, Adrian saw something he didn't expect. It wasn't just distrust, but also assessment. The girl was judging him, deciding if he was trustworthy. "I'm going to buy milk for your brother," Adrian explained, keeping his hand extended. "In the market, right there." Emily looked in the direction he pointed, and then, carefully, she stood up. She didn't take his hand, but she got to her feet, holding the baby firmly. "Okay," she said seriously, "but I'll be keeping an eye on you." An involuntary smile appeared on Adrian's face. The courage of that child was something rare. He gestured the way, and Emily followed him, maintaining a cautious distance. Inside the market, the fluorescent lights created an environment completely different from the twilight of the street. Adrian grabbed a basket and walked through the aisles, conscious of the small steps behind him. Emily watched everything in silence, her eyes registering every detail, as if she wanted to memorize the place. "What kind of milk does your brother drink?" Adrian asked, stopping in front of the dairy section. Emily pointed to a bottle of milk. "That one. Mommy said it's good for babies." Adrian took a bottle of milk, placing it in the basket. Then, without asking, he added fresh bread, a few packages of cookies, fruit, and a bottle of juice. Emily followed him, her eyes widening with each item he added. "Is all of this for us?" she finally asked, her voice betraying her surprise. Adrian nodded, without looking at her. "Yes, you need more than just milk." At the checkout, the cashier looked curiously at Adrian and then at Emily. Her gaze held an unasked question, but Adrian ignored it, paying in cash and asking for everything to be put in a sturdy bag. When they left the market, night had completely fallen. Adrian handed the bag to Emily, who took it with her free hand, still holding the baby with the other. "Thank you," she said, and then she smiled. It was a small, shy smile that lit up her face for just a second before disappearing. But it was enough to have a strange effect on Adrian. Something inside him shifted, like a rusty door being opened after years of being locked. "Are you going to be able to carry all of that?" he asked, looking at the bag and the baby. Emily nodded, determined. "I can. I've carried heavier things." That statement, said so naturally, made Adrian feel a pang of... what? It wasn't quite sadness. It was something more complex, a feeling he couldn't name. "Are you sure you don't want me to walk with you?" he offered, surprising himself again. Emily shook her head. "No need. My mum is waiting. It's not far." She took a few steps back, as if ready to leave, but then she stopped and looked directly at Adrian. "You're a good person," she declared with the brutal simplicity that only children possess. "I'll pay you back one day, I promise." Before Adrian could reply, she turned and started walking, adjusting the baby and the bag with a skill that spoke of practice. Adrian stood still, watching the small figure walk away until she turned a corner and disappeared. For a moment, he remained motionless, as if processing what had just happened. Then, without consciously planning it, he started walking in the same direction Emily had taken. He wasn't following her, he told himself. He just needed to make sure she got there safely. Keeping a discreet distance, Adrian turned the corner and saw Emily walking with determined steps down the dark sidewalk. She didn't seem afraid, despite the time and the area. Adrian followed her, always keeping his distance, entering streets that were progressively less lit and more empty. Finally, Emily reached a small, neglected park, crossing it until she came to a bridge over an urban stream. There, under the partial shelter of the structure, Adrian saw a woman sitting on some old blankets. Her hair, the same color as Emily's, was tied in a makeshift bun. Despite the circumstances, there was something dignified in her posture. Emily ran the last few feet, and the woman, who could only be her mother, lifted her face. Even from a distance, Adrian could see the relief in her eyes when she saw her children. "Mommy, look," Emily exclaimed, placing the bag on the ground. "I got milk for Tommy and other things too." The woman took the baby from Emily's arms and hugged him, before looking inside the bag. Her expression shifted from surprise to suspicion, and then to a cautious gratitude. "Emily, how—" she began to ask, but the girl interrupted her. "A nice man bought it for us. He was serious but kind." The woman looked around as if expecting to find this benevolent stranger nearby. Adrian stepped further into the shadows, suddenly feeling like an intruder. "He didn't ask for anything in return," the woman asked quietly, but with urgency. Emily shook her head. "No, Mommy. He just wanted to help. I told him I'll pay him back when I grow up." The woman smiled sadly and hugged her daughter with her free arm. "You're a good girl, Emily. Very brave." Adrian remained hidden, watching the scene. The woman opened the bag and took out the bottle of milk. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to open it. Emily sat beside her, helping to hold the baby while her mother prepared the food. It was in that moment that the reality of the situation hit Adrian with full force. Here was a family, a mother and her 2 children, living under a bridge, with nothing but a few old blankets and what they could scrounge. And yet there was love between them. There was dignity. The woman held the baby gently, feeding him carefully. Emily leaned against her mother's shoulder, her attentive eyes following every movement. There was an intimacy in that scene, a bond that Adrian had never experienced in his entire life. He felt a strange lump in his throat, as if something was stuck there. His eyes burned, and Adrian blinked, surprised by his own body's reaction. He couldn't remember the last time he felt like crying. Probably when he was a child, before his father taught him that men don't cry. The woman opened one of the cookie packages and gave one to Emily, who accepted it with a tired smile. The girl nibbled on the cookie slowly, as if wanting to make it last as long as possible. Adrian saw the mother discreetly wipe a tear from her face as the baby fell asleep in her arms, finally fed. She whispered something to Emily, who nodded and lay down on one of the blankets. The woman arranged another blanket over her daughter with a gesture of infinite tenderness. Something inside Adrian felt like it was shattering. His whole life, he had prided himself on his strength, his ability to remain unshaken. But now, faced with this scene of love amidst absolute poverty, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. How was it possible that, in a city so wealthy, a child had to beg for milk for her brother? How was it possible that a mother and her children slept in the open, under a bridge, while he lived alone in a mansion with 10 bedrooms? Adrian had always considered his success to be the exclusive result of his own effort. But now, looking at that family, he wondered how much of his success came simply from the luck of being born into favorable circumstances. The woman, he still didn't know her name, lay down beside her children, arranging the baby between herself and Emily. She pulled the last blanket over the 3 of them, forming a protective cocoon. Even in extreme poverty, she still tried to give her children comfort and security. Adrian took a step back, feeling he had witnessed something too intimate, something he had no right to see. His throat was still tight, and he took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. It was time to go. He had seen enough. More than enough. Adrian walked away silently, taking a different path to avoid passing near the family. His steps were heavy as he moved away from the park, as if he were carrying a new weight. The city streets looked different now. Adrian looked at the luxurious buildings, the illuminated storefronts, the expensive cars, and it all seemed somehow obscene in the face of what he had just witnessed. People passed by him, absorbed in their own lives, completely ignoring that, just a few blocks away, a 5-year-old child had to care for a baby while their mother struggled to survive. The walk back home seemed longer than it really was. Adrian barely noticed the streets he passed, lost in thoughts he couldn't organize. The image of Emily, so small and so brave, holding her brother with such responsibility, wouldn't leave his mind. The city lights shone around him, but Adrian saw them as if through a fog. His world, normally so orderly and predictable, seemed to have been shaken by an encounter of less than 15 minutes. When he reached the entrance of his mansion, Adrian paused for a moment, looking at the imposing structure before him. Never before had he noticed how empty the house looked, even when lit up. He entered the security code and pushed the gate open, feeling a strange weight in his chest. The immaculate gardens, the perfectly aligned stone paths, the central fountain with its crystal-clear water, everything was exactly as it had always been. But something had changed, and Adrian knew the change was inside him. He entered the house and was greeted by the familiar silence. The same silence that, until a few hours ago, he had called peace. Adrian closed the main door behind him and stood motionless for a few moments. The mansion was dark, except for the security lights he had programmed to turn on automatically at dusk. The sound system, which usually turned on with his arrival, remained silent, a setting he himself had adjusted years ago, preferring silence to music. He didn't turn on the main lights. He left his coat on the Italian marble console table in the entryway and moved through the house, his Italian shoes producing a solitary echo that reverberated off the high walls. That sound, the echo of his own footsteps, suddenly seemed different, louder, emptier, as if the house were mocking him. Adrian passed through the dining room, where a mahogany table for 12 had never hosted more than 2 guests at a time. He passed the chef's kitchen, equipped with the latest technology, which he barely knew how to operate. At the bar, he poured himself an expensive whiskey, but the taste seemed bitter in his mouth. With the glass in hand, he continued his pilgrimage through his own house. He climbed the spiral staircase, past the 5 guest rooms that had never been used, the library with books he'd bought in bulk because they matched the decor, the home theater where he often fell asleep while expensive movies played on the giant screen. Finally, he reached his personal office. This room, at least, bore his mark. It was where he spent most of his time when at home, working late, reviewing contracts, planning acquisitions, calculating profits. Adrian turned on only the lamp on his desk. The soft light cast shadows in the corners of the office. He approached the fireplace, an imposing stone structure he rarely lit, not because he disliked the warmth or the sight of the fire, but because he had never thought of it as important. He placed the glass on the fireplace mantel and looked at his own reflection in the mirror above. He saw a 42-year-old man, dark hair with graying temples, an angular face that business magazines called determined and implacable. He saw the blue-gray eyes that employees feared meeting during meetings. He saw the impeccable posture his father had insisted he maintain since childhood. "A straight back makes for a respectable man," his father used to say. Adrian unbuttoned his suit vest and allowed himself a moment of relaxation. He let his shoulders drop slightly. And then, for the first time in a long time, he truly looked himself in the eyes. What he saw surprised him. It wasn't the determination or coldness he had always associated with himself. It was something else, something that looked far too much like loneliness. Adrian moved away from the mirror and sat in the leather armchair near the fireplace. He had never admitted it to himself, but now it was impossible to deny. He was alone, completely alone. He had business partners, not friends. He had employees, not confidants. He had occasional lovers, not relationships. He had a house, not a home. Emily's face appeared in his mind. Those brown eyes, too serious for a 5-year-old. The way she held her brother, as if she were his only protection against the world. The courage in that childish voice. "Mister, he just needs a little milk. I promise to pay you back when I grow up." Adrian rubbed his face with his hands, trying to erase the image, but it persisted. He saw Emily and her mother, sleeping under the bridge, sharing old blankets but still together, united, connected by something he had never truly experienced, unconditional love. "I have everything," Adrian murmured to the empty fireplace, "and I have nothing." In that moment, a truth he had buried for years surfaced. His loneliness was not a conscious choice, but an armor he had built over time. Adrian had convinced himself that not needing anyone was a virtue, a demonstration of strength. He had turned this loneliness into something noble, into proof of independence. "I don't need anyone," he had always told himself. It was his mantra, his shield. But now, sitting alone in his perfect, empty mansion, Adrian realized the lie he had been telling himself for so long. It wasn't strength, it was fear. Fear of opening up, of becoming vulnerable, of needing someone and perhaps being rejected or abandoned. The silence of the house weighed on him like never before. Each tick-tock of the antique clock in the corner seemed to accuse. Alone, alone. Adrian stood up abruptly, as if he could escape the weight of those thoughts. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the city glittered with thousands of lights. In each of those illuminated windows were people, families, intertwined lives, and here he was, isolated in his fortress of solitude. Adrian returned to the armchair and sat down, this time with his shoulders slumped. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the emptiness that surrounded him. Not just the emptiness of the house, but the emptiness inside himself. He thought again of little Emily, of her courage, of the way she protected her brother despite being just a child, of the simple, direct love she showed. "I don't want this anymore," he said aloud, surprising himself with his own words. Adrian stood up and looked once more at his reflection in the mirror. The mask of coldness and control had fallen away, revealing the lonely man behind it. "I don't want to live like this anymore," he stated, this time with more conviction. That night, for the first time in many years, Adrian Blake admitted to himself that he was tired of his perfect, empty life. Tired of the loneliness he had built around himself like an impenetrable fortress. And more importantly, he decided it was time for a change. Adrian woke up before his alarm. For a few seconds, he lay still, staring at the white ceiling of his bedroom. The decision he had made the night before was still firm in his mind. He got up without his usual email check. He took a quick shower, put on jeans and a simple shirt, clothes he rarely wore, and went down to the kitchen. He made coffee and, while he drank it, made a mental list of what he needed to buy. For the first time in years, Adrian Blake started his own car instead of calling his driver. The black Audi pulled out of the garage and headed toward the shopping center, which opened its doors at 8 in the morning. In the supermarket, Adrian pushed a cart through the aisles with a determination he usually reserved for important negotiations. He filled the cart with non-perishable foods, fruits, vegetables, meat, milk, bread, cookies, and juices. In another section, he added personal hygiene products, soaps, shampoos, toothpaste, toothbrushes, diapers for the baby, wet wipes. The cashier looked at him curiously as he checked out with 2 full carts, but Adrian kept his expression neutral. He paid in cash and asked for help to take everything to the car. His next stop was a department store. There, he bought new blankets, sheets, towels, cans, and pillows. Then, he headed to the clothing section. He hesitated in front of the women's clothes, unsure of what sizes to choose. He opted for basic pieces in various sizes: pants, blouses, light jackets, socks, and underwear still in their packaging. For the children, he selected colorful outfits, a dress for Emily and onesies for the baby. By the time he left the store, the trunk and back seat of the Audi were completely full. Adrian looked at his watch. Almost noon. He hadn't told his office he wasn't coming in. For the first time in his career, Adrian Blake was completely ignoring his professional responsibilities without prior notice. And, surprisingly, he didn't care. The way to the park where he had seen the family the night before looked different in the daylight. The streets were busier, the abandoned buildings more visible, the reality of urban poverty more evident. Adrian parked the car at the entrance to the park and looked around, trying to remember the exact path to the bridge. He walked slowly, carrying 2 heavy bags, the first of many he would have to retrieve from the car. As he got close to the bridge, he slowed his pace. Suddenly, he felt nervous. What if they weren't there anymore? What if they had left, found another place? Or worse, what if his intrusion was not welcome? Adrian paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and continued walking. As he approached the exact spot where he had seen the family the night before, his heart raced. They were still there. Anne was sitting on the same old blankets, feeding the baby the rest of the milk he had bought. Emily was quietly playing with a small stone, drawing shapes in the dirt. It was Emily who saw him first. Her eyes widened in recognition and surprise. She nudged her mother and pointed in Adrian's direction. Anne raised her head. When she saw Adrian approaching with the bags, her expression shifted from surprise to a mixture of suspicion and hope. Adrian stopped a few feet away, not wanting to invade their space. "Good morning," he said, his voice sounding strangely formal. Emily stood up and took a small step forward. "It's the man from the market," she said to her mother, although Anne had clearly already recognized Adrian. "I'd brought some things," Adrian explained, lifting the bag slightly. "Oh, there's more in the car?" Anne adjusted the baby in her arms and stood up as well. She was shorter than Adrian had imagined, perhaps from always seeing her sitting down. Her brown hair, just like Emily's, was tied in a makeshift bun. Despite the circumstances, there was a dignity in her posture. "Why?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Adrian hadn't expected the direct question. He thought for a moment before answering honestly, "I'm not sure, it just felt like the right thing to do." Anne studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher his true intentions. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. Adrian placed the bags on the ground. "Have this food, cleaning supplies, some clothes. I'll get the rest." Before Anne could answer, Emily approached the bags and looked at Adrian with the same serious eyes from the night before. "You came back," she stated, as if it was something extraordinary. "Yes," Adrian replied, feeling something strange in his chest as he looked at the child. "I came back. I told Mommy you were a good person." Adrian didn't know how to respond to that. He mumbled something about getting the rest of the things and walked back to the car. He made 3 more trips, bringing all the bags. With each return, he found Emily and Anne carefully examining the contents of the previous bags, their faces showing a mix of relief and disbelief. When he finished bringing everything, Adrian stood there, unsure of what to do next. Part of him wanted to leave immediately. He had done his good deed, he had helped. But another part, a part he barely recognized, wanted to stay. Anne approached him, still holding the baby. Her face showed embarrassment, but also genuine gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice almost a whisper. No one has ever done something like this for us." Adrian felt a lump in his throat. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do," Anne insisted. "My name is Anne Miller. This is Emily, and the baby is Thomas. Adrian Blake," he introduced himself, extending his hand in a formal gesture that felt strange given the circumstances. Anne hesitated for a moment before briefly shaking his hand. Her touch was light, but Adrian noticed the calluses on her fingertips, hands that knew hard work. I should go," Adrian said, suddenly uncomfortable with the intensity of the gratitude in Anne's eyes. "Of course," she replied quickly, taking a step back. "You've already done much more than—" "Aren't you staying?" Emily interrupted, sounding disappointed. Adrian looked at the girl, at her hopeful eyes, and felt something inside him break. How could he explain to a child that he didn't belong here, that his life was completely different, that he was a lonely man who barely knew how to interact with other people, let alone a family in need? "I can't right now," he finally replied, "but I'll come back to see how you are." He hadn't planned on saying that. The words just came out. Emily smiled, a smile that lit up her small face and made Adrian feel that strange pressure in his chest again. "Promise?" she asked. "Emily," Anne gently chided, "we can't ask Mr. Blake for anything more. He's already been too generous." Adrian looked from Anne to Emily, and then to the baby in his mother's arms. He took a deep breath. "I promise," he said, surprising himself again. He said goodbye with an awkward wave and walked back to his car. The entire way, he felt Emily's eyes following him. When he got into the Audi and started the engine, he looked in the rearview mirror. Emily was still there, a small figure by the bridge, watching him. Adrian drove aimlessly for the next few hours, trying to understand what was happening to him. Why did he care so much about this family? Why did the sight of a mother and 2 children living under a bridge affect him so deeply? And why had he promised to come back? That night, lying in his king-size bed, Adrian couldn't sleep. The image of Emily, Anne, and little Thomas wouldn't leave his mind. The contrast between his empty mansion and that family's situation was so stark, it was almost obscene. The next day, Adrian went to the office but couldn't concentrate. He cancelled 2 meetings and spent most of the time looking out the window, lost in thought. At 3 in the afternoon, he grabbed his coat and left, ignoring his secretary's surprised look. He stopped at a coffee shop and bought sandwiches, coffee, and hot chocolate. Then, he drove straight to the park. Anne was alone when he arrived. She was sitting on the blankets, mending what looked like one of Emily's dresses. The baby slept beside her, wrapped in one of the new blankets Adrian had brought. She looked up when she heard his approaching footsteps. Her eyes showed surprise, as if she didn't really believe he would return. "Where's Emily?" Adrian asked, stopping a few feet away. "She went to get water from the park fountain," Anne replied, setting the dress aside and standing up. "She should be back soon." Adrian held up the bag with the sandwiches. "I brought something for you to eat." Anne accepted the bag with a silent thank you. Adrian noticed that she had organized all the things he had brought the day before. The bags were neatly stacked, and she had clearly chosen some clothes for herself and the children, storing the rest. There was something about the dignity with which Anne faced her situation that touched Adrian deeply. He knelt down, bringing himself to her level, and before he could think better of it, he asked, "Why are you here?" The question came out more directly than he intended, and for a moment Adrian feared he had offended Anne. But she just took a deep breath, as if preparing to tell a story she had told herself many times. "My husband left us," she began, her voice calm but filled with a restrained pain. "He met another woman at work. Younger, no children. One day he just didn't come home." Adrian nodded, keeping his eyes fixed on her, giving her space to continue. "I found out he had racked up debts, a lot of debt, credit cards, loans, all in my name too. I was working part-time at a store, but it wasn't enough to pay the bills and take care of the children." She glanced briefly at the sleeping baby before continuing. "When Thomas was born, I had complications. I was in the hospital for a week. I lost my job. I tried to find another one, but with a newborn. The bills piled up. We were evicted 3 weeks ago." Adrian felt a growing anger towards the man who had abandoned his family in such a way, an anger that surprised him with its intensity. "You don't have any family who can help? Friends?" he asked. Anne shook her head. "My parents passed away years ago. I have a sister out west, but we haven't spoken in a long time. And friends, well, people drift away when you start having problems." At that moment, Emily returned, carrying a plastic bottle full of water. Her face lit up when she saw Adrian. "You came back," she exclaimed, running to him. "You promised and you really came back." The girl's joy was so genuine, so pure, that Adrian felt that pressure in his chest again. Without thinking, he reached out and lightly touched Emily's hair. "I promised," he said simply. Emily sat next to her mother, looking eagerly at the bag of food. Anne opened one of the sandwiches and broke it in half, giving one piece to her daughter. Adrian watched as they ate, noticing how Anne took small bites, as if trying to make the food last longer. An idea that had been forming in his mind since the night before grew into a certainty. It was an absurd, impulsive idea, completely out of character for him. But somehow, it seemed like the only possible path. Adrian took a deep breath, surprised by what he was about to say, but at the same time, absolutely sure of his decision. "I have a big house," he began, the words coming out with a naturalness that surprised him. "I need help. You can live there." Anne froze, the sandwich halfway to her mouth. Her eyes widened in shock. What?" she whispered. "My house is too big for one person," Adrian continued, the idea solidifying as he spoke. "There are empty rooms, extra space. You could help take care of the house, and in return, you would have a place to stay." Anne slowly lowered the sandwich, her face a mask of disbelief and caution. You barely know us," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," Adrian admitted, "and you barely know me. But you need a place to live, and He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I need to not be alone." It was the most sincere truth Adrian had spoken in years. He needed to not be alone. He needed that family in his empty house, not just for them, but for himself. Emily looked from Adrian to her mother, her big eyes absorbing every word of the conversation, though she probably didn't understand all the implications. Anne covered her face with her hands for a moment, and when she lowered them, Adrian saw tears in her eyes. "I accept," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Anything." Those last two words hit Adrian like a punch. Anything. The desperation contained in them, the vulnerability, the complete lack of options. "It's not anything," he hurried to clarify. "It's just mutual help. You'll have your own space, your privacy. I'm not asking for anything in return other than some help with the house." Anne studied him for a long time, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. Finally, she nodded. "When?" she asked simply. "Now," Adrian replied. "We can go now." In less than 10 minutes, all of the family's belongings were gathered and placed in the trunk of the Audi. It wasn't much, just the clothes and items Adrian had brought the day before. plus a small backpack with Anne's documents and some of the children's mementos. As he helped Emily settle into the back seat, Adrian felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him couldn't believe what he was doing, taking a family of strangers into his home. But another part, a part that seemed to be waking up after a long sleep, felt it was exactly what he should be doing. When he started the car and began driving toward his mansion, Adrian looked in the rearview mirror and saw Emily holding her sleeping brother's hand. The girl smiled at him, a smile full of trust and hope. And in that moment, Adrian knew that something inside him had broken for good. The barrier he had built around his heart, the wall that had kept him isolated for so long, had crumbled. And strangely, instead of feeling fear, Adrian felt relief. The electronic gate opened with a soft hum. Adrian drove slowly up the stone path that cut through the mansion's front garden. In the rearview mirror, he saw Emily's eyes widen as she watched the central fountain, the perfectly trimmed trees, the flower beds. Anne was also looking out the window, but her expression was harder to read. There was amazement, yes, but also apprehension. She held Thomas against her chest as if the baby were a shield. Adrian parked the car at the entrance of the house and turned off the engine. For a moment, no one moved. The silence inside the vehicle contrasted with the soft sound of the fountain's water and the occasional bird song. "We're here," Adrian finally said, his voice strangely formal. He got out of the car and opened the back door for Emily. The girl got out slowly, her eyes scanning the mansion's facade, the stone columns, the huge windows. Anne got out from the other side, still holding Thomas. Her face showed a mixture of discomfort and awe as she joined Emily at the entrance. Adrian took the few bags from the trunk, everything that family owned in the world, and gestured toward the main door. "Come on," he said simply. Emily held her mother's hand as they walked the short distance to the entrance. Adrian typed the code on the panel next to the door, and it opened silently. He stepped aside, allowing Anne and Emily to enter first. The entryway, with its marble floor and curved staircase, seemed even more imposing seen through the eyes of its new occupants. Adrian watched Emily spin around slowly, looking at the high ceiling, the crystal chandelier, the walls with expensive abstract paintings. "You live here," Emily began, her small voice tiny in the vast space. "Alone?" Adrian felt his chest tighten at the simple question. "Yes," he replied, placing the bags on the floor. "I live alone." The girl frowned, as if that were hard to comprehend. "But it's so big." "Emily," Anne gently chided, "don't be nosy." "It's all right," Adrian assured, though the child's observation had touched on something painful inside him. "Come, I'll show you the house." He led them through the ground floor, showing them the formal living room, which he rarely used, the dining room with the table for 12, the media room with leather sofas and a giant flat-screen TV, the professional kitchen, equipped with appliances he barely knew how to operate, the music room with a piano he never played. With each new room, Emily's eyes widened further, and Anne's discomfort seemed to grow. Adrian began to see his own house through their eyes, excessively large, unnecessarily luxurious, strangely devoid of any human warmth. They went up to the second floor. Adrian showed them the guest rooms, never used, and indicated which ones they could occupy. "This one can be for Emily," he said, opening the door to a room decorated in soft shades of blue and white. "And this one next to it has space for a crib for Thomas." Anne looked at Emily's room, then at Adrian. "It's very kind, but maybe it's better if we stay together, at least at first. Thomas still wakes up during the night, and Emily—" She hesitated. "Emily has nightmares sometimes." Adrian nodded quickly. "Of course, you can stay in the main guest suite. Then, it has an adjoining room that can serve as a bedroom for the children." He led them there, a spacious room with a king-size bed, a private bathroom, and a small adjacent room that, with a few adjustments, could accommodate Emily and Thomas's crib. "This is perfect," Anne said, clearly relieved to be able to keep her children close. Emily ran to the window and looked out. "Look, Mommy, you can see the fountain from here." Adrian watched the girl, her childish excitement contrasting with the seriousness she had shown in the previous days. It was as if, Now safe, she could finally just be a child. "So we need to buy a crib for Thomas," Adrian commented, "and maybe some things to make the room more comfortable for you." "You've already done so much for us," Anne said quickly. "We don't want to be any more trouble." "It's no trouble," Adrian replied, though part of him wondered what exactly he was doing. "Guess we'll sort it out tomorrow." He showed them where the towels were, how the shower worked, where the temperature controls were. Anne absorbed every piece of information attentively, as if memorizing instructions for an important test. "Make yourselves at home," Adrian said finally, feeling strangely out of place in his own house. "I'll be in the office if you need anything." He withdrew, closing the office door behind him. He sat at his desk and turned on his computer, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. There were dozens of unread emails, missed calls, urgent messages. Adrian tried to focus on them, but his mind kept returning to the people who now occupied his house. What was he doing? What madness had possessed him to bring strangers to live with him? Adrian Blake, the man who valued his privacy and independence above all else, was now sharing his space with a woman and 2 children he barely knew. He spent the next few hours immersed in work, trying to ignore the occasional sounds coming from the rest of the house. Soft footsteps in the hallway, Anne's low voice talking to Emily, the distant cry of the baby. When he finally left the office, it was past 9 at night. The house was silent. Adrian walked to the kitchen and found everything impeccably clean. On the table, covered by a dish towel, was a plate of simple sandwiches. Adrian felt a strange lump in his throat. Someone had prepared food for him. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened. He ate in silence, listening to the night sounds of the house, the ticking of the old clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator, and something new, the soft sound of breathing coming from upstairs. In the following days, Adrian established a routine. He would get up early, have a quick coffee, and lock himself in his office. He lunched alone, usually on something Anne had left prepared, and went back to work. In the evening, when he finally left the office, he would have dinner in the kitchen, exchange a few polite words with Anne, and retreat to his room. It was a careful coexistence, with invisible lines that no one dared to cross. Adrian kept his distance, convincing himself it was for the best. They needed a place to stay, he had offered. It didn't mean they had to become a family. Even so, the sounds of the house began to change. It was no longer just the silence Adrian knew so well. Now there was Emily's occasional laughter, Anne's light footsteps down the hall, Thomas's cry followed by his mother's soft voice calming him. At first, these sounds bothered him. They distracted him from work, constantly reminding him that he was no longer alone. Adrian found himself annoyed by the clatter of pans in the kitchen when Anne prepared lunch, or by Emily's occasional questions when he passed her in the hallway. On the 4th day, Adrian was sitting in his office when he heard a soft knock on the door. It was the first time anyone had knocked. Anne had always been careful not to disturb his space. "Sir, come in," he said, surprised. The door opened slowly, and Emily poked her head in. Her hair was in a simple braid, probably done by Anne. "Mr. Adrian," she called, her voice small. Adrian sat up straighter in his chair. "Yes, Emily." "Mommy said I shouldn't bother you, but—" She hesitated, biting her lip. "I was wondering if I could borrow a book from your shelf. There are so many beautiful books." Adrian looked at the bookshelf behind him. Business books, biographies, some classics he had bought but never read. There was nothing specifically for children there. "Of course," he replied. "Not sure if there was anything appropriate for a 5-year-old. Emily cautiously entered the office, as if stepping into sacred territory. She approached the bookshelf and looked at the titles, tilting her head to read the spines. "You can read already?" Adrian asked, genuinely curious. Emily nodded. "Some words. Mommy was teaching me before—" She paused, as if she had remembered something sad. "Before we came here." Adrian felt that strange pressure in his chest again. "Maybe we can buy some children's books for you tomorrow." Emily's face lit up. "Really? Real books? Just for me?" "Yes," Adrian confirmed, surprised by the pleasure he felt at seeing the girl's joy. "Real books? Just for you?" Emily smiled, a smile that completely transformed her serious face. "Thank you, Mr. Adrian." She selected a book with a colorful cover, an illustrated edition of classic fairy tales that Adrian didn't even remember owning, and left the office, closing the door carefully behind her. Adrian stared at the closed door for a long moment. Something had changed in that brief interaction. A small crack had formed in the wall he kept between himself and his new house guests. The next morning, when Adrian left his room, he smelled fresh coffee and toast. He followed the aroma to the kitchen and found Anne preparing breakfast. Emily was sitting at the table, flipping through the book she had borrowed the day before. Thomas was in a small makeshift nest of blankets on a chair, gurgling contentedly. "Good morning," Anne said, turning as she heard his footsteps. "I hope you don't mind. I made coffee." "No, of course not," Adrian replied, feeling strangely shy. "That's kind of you." Anne placed a cup of coffee and a plate of toast on the table. "It's the least I can do. You gave us a roof over our heads, food—" "Mr. Adrian," Emily exclaimed, interrupting her mother. "Look what I found in the book." She pointed to a colorful illustration of a castle. "It looks like your house." Adrian smiled involuntarily as he sat down at the table. "My house isn't as big as a castle, Emily." "Almost," the girl insisted. "And it has a fountain, just like in the book." Adrian took a sip of coffee. It was exactly how he liked it, strong with little sugar. Anne must have noticed how he prepared his coffee in the previous days. "The coffee is great," he commented. Anne smiled shyly. "Glad you like it. I wish I could help more." "You've been so generous, and you're already helping," Adrian interrupted her gently. "The house has never been so clean and organized." It was true. In the few days since they had arrived, Anne had subtly transformed the mansion. The rooms felt more airy. The surfaces shone, and small touches, a vase with flowers from the garden on the coffee table, neatly arranged cushions on the sofa, made the spaces more welcoming. "Still," Anne insisted, "I'd like to do more. I can cook full meals if you'd like. I'm no chef, but I can make simple, tasty dishes." Adrian realized he couldn't remember the last time he had a real home-cooked meal. "That would be nice," he replied. That evening, when Adrian left his office, he found the dining table set for 3, a place for him, one for Anne and one for Emily, with Thomas in his makeshift nest nearby. There was a simple roast, steamed vegetables and fresh bread. "I hope you don't mind that we used the dining table," Anne said quickly when she saw him. "I thought it would be nice to have dinner together, but if you'd prefer to eat alone—" "No," Adrian replied, surprising himself. "It's a good idea." It was a strange meal, initially quiet and awkward. Adrian wasn't used to talking during meals, but Emily, with the naturalness of children, soon filled the silence with questions and observations. "Why do you have so many rooms if you live alone?" she asked between bites. "Emily," Anne chided, blushing. "That's not polite." "It's all right," Adrian assured. "Actually, I never really thought about it. I bought the house because I could, I suppose. But don't you get sad having so much empty space?" Emily persisted. Adrian looked at the girl, surprised by the insight of her question. "I guess so," he finally admitted. "Sometimes it gets very quiet." Anne looked at him with an expression Adrian couldn't decipher, perhaps compassion, perhaps understanding. From that day on, something began to change. Adrian still spent most of his time in the office, but the doors, both literal and metaphorical, started to open a little wider. Anne cooked simple but flavorful meals, kept the house clean and organized, and gradually added small touches that made the rooms more welcoming. Emily helped set the table for meals and developed an insatiable curiosity for every corner of the mansion. Thomas grew up in safety, his nighttime cries gradually diminishing. The sounds of the house, which initially bothered Adrian, began to become familiar, even comforting. The sound of footsteps in the hall, Emily's occasional laughter, the lullabies Anne sang to Thomas, all of it formed a new soundscape that, surprisingly, Adrian was beginning to appreciate. The days passed, and a routine settled in almost naturally. Adrian still spent many hours in his home office, but he began to make small concessions to his usual isolation. Sometimes he would leave the door ajar while he worked. Other times, he would come out for a coffee in the mid-afternoon and find Emily reading in the living room, or Anne folding clothes. In the mornings, Adrian would leave early to go to the company. It was something he had done for years, without a second thought. But now, as he picked up his car keys, he felt a strange reluctance to leave the house. "I'll be back in the late afternoon," he would tell Anne before leaving. Emily, who was usually already awake, would watch him from the stairs or the hallway. "See you later, mister." "Adrian Vargas," she would say in her small voice. During the day, while dealing with important meetings and decisions, Adrian would find himself thinking about the house, not the physical structure, but the people who now inhabited it. And when the workday ended, instead of extending his work or accepting invitations for business dinners as he used to, he would hurry to get back. The feeling that greeted him when he opened the door was completely new. There was light, movement, the smell of food being prepared. There was life. When he finally got home, sometimes late at night, he expected to find everything dark and silent. Instead, there was often a light on in the kitchen. Anne would be there, making tea or organizing something for the next day. "So I thought you'd be asleep by now," Adrian commented one night, placing his briefcase on the counter. "I thought you might want something to eat after a long day," she explained, turning to him. "I saved some of the dinner." Adrian accepted the plate she offered, feeling a warmth that didn't just come from the food. "Oh, thank you," he said. And then, after a moment's hesitation, "It's good to be back." And to his surprise, it was true. The house that had always been just a place to sleep now felt different. It felt alive. And for the first time in many years, Adrian Blake felt like he was coming home, not just to an empty mansion. Adrian parked the car at the shopping center, turned off the engine, and sat for a few minutes, contemplating what he was about to do. In his 42 years, he had never set foot in a toy store. He had never picked out a gift for a child. The idea made him strangely nervous. However, in recent days, something had changed. The presence of Emily, Anne, and little Thomas in his house was no longer just a temporary situation, a good deed on his part. It had become something more, something Adrian still couldn't name, but that made him want to do more than simply offer a roof and food. He got out of the car and walked towards the mall. A colorful storefront caught his eye. "The Toy Palace," announced the sign in playful letters. Adrian took a deep breath and went inside. The inside of the store was a universe of colors, sounds, and movement. Toys of all kinds filled shelves up to the ceiling. Dolls and cars and games, stuffed animals. Adrian looked around, momentarily disoriented by the vastness of options. "Can I help you?" a saleswoman asked with a friendly smile. Adrian hesitated. "I'm looking for something for a 5-year-old girl." "Any preferences? Dolls, educational games, art kits?" Art. The word sparked a memory. Emily flipping through the book she had taken from his office, her eyes shining as she saw the colorful illustrations. "Something related to drawing, perhaps," Adrian suggested, "and also something for a baby about a year old." The saleswoman nodded and guided him through the store, showing him options. Adrian chose carefully: a sketchbook with a colorful cover, a box of vibrant colored pencils, a small sturdy plastic easel. For Thomas, he selected a soft teddy bear and some building blocks with animal figures. Before heading to the checkout, Adrian noticed a small shelf with children's books. He remembered the promise he had made to Emily days ago. He selected several titles with beautiful illustrations and simple stories, suitable for a child learning to read. "A gift for your children?" the saleswoman asked as she wrapped everything. Adrian opened his mouth to correct the mistake, but something stopped him. "Yes," he replied simply, surprising himself. On the way back home, Adrian found himself anticipating Emily's reaction. He had never particularly cared about the happiness of others, not in a personal, involved way. He had made donations to charities, of course, but always in a distant, impersonal manner. This was the first time he wanted to see, with his own eyes, the result of his generosity. When he arrived home, he found Anne in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Thomas was in his makeshift playpen, playing with a wooden spoon. "Where's Emily?" Adrian asked, keeping the bags hidden behind his back. "In the living room reading," Anne replied, casting a curious glance at Adrian's unusually eager expression. Adrian nodded and walked to the living room. Emily was sitting on the rug, flipping through the same book she had taken from his office days ago. Her hair, now always clean and combed, fell over her concentrated face. "Emily," Adrian called, his voice softer than usual. The girl looked up and smiled when she saw him. It was no longer the shy, cautious smile of the first few days, but something more relaxed, more natural. Adrian realized that Emily was no longer afraid of him. "I have something for you," he said, bringing the bags to the front. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. She carefully closed the book and stood up, approaching with curiosity. Adrian knelt, getting on her level, and began to take the gifts out of the bags. First the books, and which he stacked to the side. Then the sketchbook with the colorful cover, the box of pencils, and the small easel. Emily remained motionless, looking at the gifts with an expression Adrian couldn't decipher. For a terrible moment, he feared he had made a mistake. Maybe she didn't like to draw. Maybe the gifts were inappropriate. Then, slowly, Emily reached out and touched the sketchbook. Her small fingers slid over the colorful cover, feeling the texture. She opened it carefully, as if it was something fragile and precious, and flipped through the blank pages. "Is it for me?" she asked in a low voice, as if she was afraid she had misunderstood. "All of this is for you," Adrian confirmed. "And these," he added, taking Thomas's toys out of the bag, "are for your brother." Emily looked at the gifts, then at Adrian, and back at the gifts. Her expression was one of pure amazement, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Slowly, she picked up the sketchbook and the box of pencils, holding them against her chest with a care that squeezed Adrian's heart. This wasn't how a child normally reacted to presents. It was as if she had never received something that was just hers before. "Thank you, mister," she whispered, her voice so quiet Adrian could barely hear it. Something in the formality of that "mister," the same word she had used when they first met, hit Adrian deeply. Despite living under the same roof for weeks, to Emily he was still the mister who had bought milk for her brother that first day. "You can call me Adrian," he said gently. Emily nodded, still hugging the gifts. "Thank you, Adrian." At that moment, Anne entered the living room, drying her hands on a dish towel. She stopped at the door when she saw the scene. Adrian kneeling on the rug, Emily hugging the sketchbook and pencils, toys scattered around. "What?" she began, but Emily interrupted her, running to her mother. "Look, Mommy, the Miss Adrian bought them for me. And there are things for Tommy, too." Anne looked at the gifts, then at Adrian, a silent question in her eyes. "I thought they would like them," Adrian explained, feeling suddenly embarrassed under Anne's piercing gaze. "They're just a few simple things." Anne opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly at a loss for words. Then something happened that Adrian had never seen before. She smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face and softened the lines of worry that seemed permanently etched there. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice thick with restrained emotion. Emily, oblivious to the intensity of the moment between the adults, was already sitting on the floor, opening the box of pencils. Her eyes shone as she examined each color, carefully lining them up in rainbow order. "Tommy, look," she called, and Anne brought the baby from the playpen to his sister. Thomas, with a baby's natural curiosity, immediately tried to grab one of the pencils, but Emily gently moved it away. "No, Tommy, you have your own toys," she explained with the seriousness of an older sister doing her duty. Then she picked up the teddy bear and the colorful blocks, showing them to her brother. "Look what Adrian brought for you." Adrian remained where he was, watching the scene. Emily explained each color to Thomas with surprising patience for someone so young. The baby babbled, trying to repeat the words, while playing with the colorful blocks. Anne sat on the sofa, watching her children with an expression softened by joy and gratitude. Occasionally, her gaze met Adrian's, and there was something new there, a kind of connection that didn't exist before. Adrian felt a strange warmth in his chest, a sensation that spread slowly. He had never imagined that seeing a child happy with something as simple as colored pencils and a sketchbook could bring so much satisfaction. He had never imagined that doing something for someone, not out of obligation or expectation of return, but simply to bring joy, could make him feel so complete. For the first time in a long time, maybe for the first time in his life, Adrian Blake felt a genuine pride in something he had done. It wasn't the pride he felt when closing a big deal or acquiring another company. It was something deeper, more personal, something that touched a part of him he didn't even know existed. In the days that followed, Emily was rarely seen without her sketchbook and pencils. She drew in every free moment, sitting at the table after meals, on the living room rug while Adrian read the newspaper, in the garden under the shade of a tree. Adrian noticed that she always hid what she was drawing when he approached, quickly closing the sketchbook or turning the page. He didn't question it, respecting her privacy, although he felt a genuine curiosity about what so absorbed her. Anne commented one evening as they prepared dinner together, another subtle but significant change in their routine, that she had never seen Emily so happy and focused. She always liked to draw, Anne said, chopping vegetables, but she never had her own materials. At school, she always had to return the pencils at the end of class. Adrian nodded, feeling that strange pressure in his chest again. The idea of a child never owning something as simple and fundamental as colored pencils was hard to conceive for someone who had grown up with every material privilege. A week after giving the gifts, Adrian was in the living room, reviewing some work documents, when he heard light footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw Emily standing in the doorway, holding her sketchbook against her chest. "Adrian," she called, her voice small but determined. There was no longer any hesitation when she said his name. "Yes, Emily," he replied, setting the documents aside. The girl approached, biting her lower lip in a gesture Adrian now recognized as a sign of nervousness. I made something for you," she said, carefully opening the sketchbook. Adrian felt a wave of unexpected curiosity and emotion. Emily turned the sketchbook towards him, showing a drawing that filled an entire page. On the paper, with childish but surprisingly detailed strokes for a 5-year-old, were 4 figures holding hands. A tall man with dark hair, clearly Adrian, stood next to a female figure with brown hair who could only be Anne. Between them, 2 smaller figures, a girl in a colorful dress and a baby represented only by a large head and a small body. Everyone was smiling, with big smiles drawn in semicircles. Above them, a bright yellow sun, and in the background, a house that vaguely resembled Adrian's mansion, with many windows and a fountain in front. Is that us?" Adrian asked, his voice strangely hoarse. Emily nodded, watching his reaction closely. "It's our family," she explained with the direct simplicity of children. Then she pointed to the figure representing Adrian. "That's you. You saved us." Adrian felt something tighten in his throat, a lump he couldn't swallow. "Tha's family," he repeated softly, the word sounding strange and yet perfectly right on his lips. Emily smiled, apparently pleased with his reaction. "Can I put it on the fridge? My teacher at school always put our drawings on the wall." Adrian nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Emily ran off towards the kitchen, probably to ask Anne for help hanging the drawing. Adrian remained seated, looking at the empty space where the drawing had been. "You saved us," she had said, with the simplicity and honesty only a child could have. But the truth that hit Adrian at that moment was very different. It wasn't he who had saved Emily, Anne, and Thomas. It was they who had saved him, from loneliness, from emptiness, from the purposeless life he had led before they arrived. For the first time, Adrian fully understood what had happened. He wasn't just someone who had helped a family in need. He had become part of their story, just as they had become part of his. Together, they were writing a new chapter, not just in their lives, but in his as well. Adrian stood up and walked to the kitchen. On the refrigerator, held by a colorful magnet, was Emily's drawing. Anne was setting the table for dinner, while Thomas happily banged a spoon on his high chair. Emily, seeing Adrian enter, smiled. "How did you like it?" she asked, pointing to the drawing. Adrian looked at the 4 figures holding hands under the bright sun. "It's the most beautiful drawing I've ever seen," he replied with absolute sincerity. And in that moment, in that once cold and impersonal kitchen, now full of life and warmth, Adrian Blake understood the true meaning of family, not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete reality made of small moments, of holding hands, of drawings on the fridge, a reality that, against all odds, he was now a part of. Weeks turned into months, and the presence of Anne, Emily, and Thomas in Adrian's mansion ceased to be a novelty and became a natural part of life. The routine had settled with a tranquility Adrian had never imagined possible. The mornings were filled with the sound of little footsteps, occasional laughter, and the scent of fresh coffee. The evenings brought shared dinners, simple conversations, and the comforting feeling of having a place and people to come back to. Adrian still worked a lot, but something had changed. Work was no longer the center of his existence, just a part of it. He began to decline unnecessary evening commitments, to end meetings on time, to delegate tasks he once insisted on doing himself, all so he could get home earlier. On that autumn morning, Adrian came down for coffee, feeling a slight pressure in his chest. He attributed it to stress. He had an important meeting with investors that day. He ignored the discomfort and sat at the table, where Emily was already eating cereal while drawing in her notebook. "Good morning," Anne said, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "Did you sleep well?" Adrian nodded, forcing a smile. The pressure in his chest had increased a little, but he didn't want to worry her. "Yes, thank you." "And you?" Tommy woke up twice, but he went back to sleep quickly. "He's teething." Adrian looked at the baby, who was playing with colorful blocks in his high chair. Thomas was no longer the fragile baby he had first seen in Emily's arms. Now he was a sturdy toddler, with rosy cheeks and a smile that showed 4 little teeth. "What are you going to do today?" he asked Emily, who looked up from her drawing. "Mommy is going to teach me how to write my full name," the girl answered proudly. "And we're going to make cookies." "That sounds fun. I hope you save some for me." Emily smiled, that smile that always made something stir inside Adrian's chest. "We'll save the prettiest ones." Adrian tried to take a sip of coffee, but the pressure in his chest suddenly intensified. He put the cup down, feeling his breathing become difficult. A cold sweat started to form on his forehead. "Are you okay?" Anne asked, noticing his paleness. "Adrian." He tried to answer, but the pain was now radiating down his left arm. It felt like someone was squeezing his chest in a vice. He tried to stand up, but his legs seemed to lose their strength. "Adrian!" Anne's voice sounded distant, as if coming from a tunnel. The last thing he saw before the world went dark was Emily's face, her big eyes wide with terror. Adrian felt himself falling, but there was no impact, just darkness, and then nothing. As consciousness began to return, the first thing Adrian noticed was a weight on his hand. Someone was holding it firmly. He opened his eyes slowly, the ambient light seeming painfully bright. "He's awake!" Emily's voice, tense and relieved at the same time. Adrian blinked a few times, trying to focus his vision. He was lying on the kitchen floor, his head resting on what felt like a sofa cushion. Anne was kneeling beside him, holding his hand. Emily was nearby, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Don't try to get up," Anne said, her voice firm but gentle. "The ambulance is on its way." "What happened?" Adrian managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "You passed out. I think it might have been a heart attack." The word hung in the air like a sentence. Adrian tried to assess his body. The pain in his chest had subsided to a dull, constant pressure. Breathing was still difficult, but not impossible. "How long?" he started to ask. "A few minutes," Anne replied. "I called for an ambulance immediately." "They should be here soon." Adrian realized that Emily was still crying silently. The girl had her fists clenched so tightly that her knuckles were white. "Emily," he called softly, "it's okay. I'm going to be fine." The girl came closer, her eyes fixed on him as if she feared he might disappear at any moment. "You fell," she said, her voice trembling. "Like Michael's dad from school, his dad never came back." Adrian felt a pang in his heart that had nothing to do with his physical condition. "I will come back," he promised. "Don't worry." Emily nodded but didn't seem convinced. She knelt beside him and, to Adrian's surprise, laid her head on his shoulder, hugging him tightly. Adrian felt the dampness of her tears on his neck. Anne continued to hold his hand, her fingers discreetly checking his pulse every few seconds. Adrian looked at her, noticing the genuine concern in her eyes. It wasn't just the concern of someone for the person they depended on financially. It was something deeper. "I'm sorry for scaring you," Adrian said, his voice still weak. "Don't talk," Anne replied. "Save your strength." But Adrian felt a sudden urgency, a need to say things he had never said before. The brush with death, because that's what he had felt when the pain exploded in his chest, had awakened an unexpected clarity in him. "Anne," he called, squeezing her hand. "I need to say something." She shook her head. "It can wait. You need to—" "No," Adrian interrupted, feeling tears welling up in his eyes. "It can't wait." He took a deep breath, ignoring the pain the movement caused. I've never told anyone this," he began, his voice thick with restrained emotion. "My mother died young. I was 8. Cancer. My father was cold, always was. After she was gone, he got worse. I never had a real family. I never knew what that was." Adrian paused, tears now streaming freely down his face. Emily lifted her head, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I never knew what this was, what I have with you," Adrian completed, his voice almost a whisper. Anne squeezed his hand firmly, her own eyes welling up. "We never had this either," she replied softly. "Not like this." Adrian closed his eyes, letting the tears fall without embarrassment. Years of repressed emotions, of loneliness disguised as independence, of voids filled with work and material achievements. It all seemed to surface now, as he lay on his kitchen floor, surrounded by people who, in a few short months, had become more important to him than anything he had ever owned. The distant sound of sirens broke the moment. Anne stood up quickly. "They're here," she said, heading to the door. "Emily, stay with Adrian. I'll show the paramedics the way." Emily nodded seriously, as if she had been given a mission of the utmost importance. She sat beside Adrian, holding his hand as she had seen her mother do. "Don't be scared," the girl said, repeating words Adrian suspected Anne used to comfort her. "The doctors will take care of you." Adrian smiled faintly, touched by the role reversal. "I know," he replied, "and so will you." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Paramedics came in, asked questions, took his blood pressure and heart rate, and placed him on a stretcher. Anne answered their questions calmly and precisely, as if she had trained for this. "Son, I want to go with him," Emily insisted as they started to wheel Adrian to the ambulance. "That's not possible, sweetie," Anne explained, kneeling to be at her daughter's level. "But we'll meet him at the hospital as soon as we drop Tommy off with the neighbor." Emily reluctantly agreed, but ran to the stretcher before Adrian was loaded into the ambulance. "Come home," she pleaded, her large, serious eyes fixed on him. "Promise." Adrian felt his heart, that heart he now knew was fragile, clench at the intensity of her request. "I promise," he replied, and it was a promise he intended to keep at all costs. The days in the hospital passed slowly. Tests confirmed a mild heart attack caused by a partially blocked artery. The doctors talked about stress, diet, moderate exercise, regular medication. Adrian listened with unusual attention, asking questions he never would have thought to ask before. It wasn't just his life at stake now. There were people who depended on him, who were waiting for him. Anne and Emily visited him every day. Anne brought home-cooked food, ignoring Adrian's weak protests that the hospital provided meals. Emily brought new drawings, which soon covered the wall next to his hospital bed. Thomas, who couldn't enter the ICU, sent kisses via his sister, who delivered them solemnly, making Adrian smile even in his most uncomfortable moments. On the 4th day, the doctors finally discharged him. Adrian was paler, thinner, but his eyes had a different shine, the shine of someone who had been given a second chance and was determined not to waste it. Anne came to pick him up, bringing clean clothes and the attentive care that had characterized her days at the hospital. On the way home, she drove with extra caution, casting frequent glances at Adrian in the passenger seat. "Thank you," Adrian said at one point, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Anne glanced at him quickly. For what? For everything. For taking care of me. For bringing Emily. For being there. Anne smiled. That rare smile Adrian had learned to cherish. It's what families do, she replied simply. Families. The word still sounded strange, but more and more right. When they arrived at the mansion, Adrian felt an unexpected emotion upon seeing the familiar facade. He had never before felt this sense of return, this relief at coming home. It had always been just a place to sleep and work. Now it was so much more. Anne helped him inside, ignoring his protests that he could walk on his own. In the entryway, Adrian stopped, surprised by what he saw. A colorful, clearly handmade banner stretched across the living room doorway. "Welcome home, Adrian." The letters were uneven, some uppercase mixed with lowercase, and there were drawings of hearts and stars all over it. Emily's work, no doubt. "She worked on it for 2 days," Anne commented, noticing his gaze. "She wanted it to be perfect for your return." Adrian felt a lump in his throat. "It is perfect," he managed to say. Anne led him to the living room, where an even bigger surprise awaited him. Adrian's favorite armchair had been prepared with extra cushions and a soft blanket. Beside it, on a small table, was a tray with hot tea. The doctor's prescribed medications carefully arranged, and a small vase with flowers from the garden. Thomas slept peacefully in his portable playpen in the corner of the room, his peaceful sleep a contrast to the turmoil of the past few days. And on the rug next to the armchair was Emily. Sitting cross-legged, she hugged the sketchbook Adrian had given her months ago. When he entered, she looked up but didn't stand, didn't run to him as Adrian had half expected. Instead, she just watched him in silence, her big eyes examining him carefully, as if to make sure he was really okay. There was something in that look, a mixture of relief, concern, and a love so simple and direct it almost hurt, that touched Adrian deeply. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was just a child, sitting in silence, holding a gift he had given her, looking at him with eyes that said more than words ever could. Adrian sat in the armchair prepared for him, feeling the exhaustion from the hospital trip. Anne handed him a cup of tea and discreetly retreated to the kitchen, giving them a moment alone. "You kept your promise," Emily said finally, her voice small but firm. "I promised I'd come back," Adrian replied, "and here I am." Emily nodded, satisfied. Then, slowly, she stood up and approached the armchair. Carefully, as if afraid of hurting him, she leaned against his side, her small, warm body a comforting presence. "I made more drawings for you," she said, opening the sketchbook. "But so you'll be happy and get better faster." Adrian looked at the colorful pages, scenes of all of them together, at home, in the garden, in the kitchen, everyday moments transformed into art through a child's eyes. In that moment, with Emily by his side showing him her drawings, the warm tea in his hands, the medication so carefully arranged, the baby sleeping peacefully in the corner, and Anne in the kitchen preparing something that already scented the house, Adrian realized a simple but profound truth. The simplest gestures are the ones that fill the heart the most. It wasn't professional achievements, million-dollar acquisitions, or material possessions that gave life meaning. It was these small moments of connection, of mutual care, of presence. It was knowing there were people who noticed his absence, who cared about his well-being, who waited for his return. Adrian put his arm around Emily's small shoulders and closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a gratitude so intense he could barely contain it. His heart might be fragile, as the doctors had said, but it had never been so full. Spring had arrived, bringing new beginnings with it. The mansion's garden bloomed with vibrant colors, roses, tulips, and daisies that Anne had planted months earlier. Sunlight streamed generously through the windows, creating golden patterns on the kitchen floor. Adrian had fully recovered from the heart attack. He followed the new diet strictly, walked every morning in the garden, and took his medication at the exact times, not because he feared for his own life, but because he had promised Emily he would be okay. A promise he wouldn't dare break. His work pace had changed drastically. He had delegated responsibilities, reduced his hours, and started refusing long trips. His partners didn't understand the sudden change in the man who had always been known for his relentless dedication to business, but Adrian didn't care what they thought. His priorities had changed. On that Sunday morning, the sun shone with special intensity. Adrian was making pancakes, a newly acquired skill that made Emily laugh every time he tried to flip them in the air. Anne was cutting fresh fruit, occasionally casting amused glances at Adrian's culinary attempts. Thomas, now almost 2, was banging a wooden spoon on his high chair tray, creating a disjointed beat that served as the soundtrack to the domestic scene. "I think this one turned out almost perfect," Adrian announced, sliding a pancake onto Emily's plate. The girl examined the pancake critically, then smiled. "It's better than the last one. It doesn't look like a squashed half-moon anymore." Anne laughed, placing the bowl of fruit on the table. "Emily, be nice. Adrian is trying his best." "I am being nice," the girl protested. "I said it's better." Adrian smiled, sitting down at the table. Sundays had become his favorite days. No work, no commitments, just the 4 of them together at home. Simple as that. Emily covered her pancake with honey and took a large bite, leaving a golden mustache on her upper lip. Thomas immediately tried to imitate his sister, reaching for the honey pot. "No, Tommy," Anne intervened quickly. "You're too little for honey." The boy pouted in disappointment, a look that lasted only until Anne put pieces of banana on his plate. He picked them up with his chubby fingers, smiling with satisfaction. Adrian watched the scene with a sense of fullness that still surprised him. How could something so simple, a family breakfast, bring so much happiness? Before, he used to have coffee alone, usually standing up while checking emails. Now these shared meals were the highlight of his days. "What are you thinking about?" Anne asked, noticing his contemplative gaze. Adrian shook his head, smiling. "About how much everything has changed. For the better." Emily finished her pancake and wiped her mouth with a napkin, a formality Adrian found adorable. She looked at him with that serious expression she sometimes assumed, the same one she had when they first met. "I still want to pay for everything," she said suddenly, her voice small but determined. Adrian blinked, confused for a moment. Then he remembered that first night, the little girl on the market sidewalk holding her baby brother. "Mister, he just needs a little milk. I promise to pay you back when I grow up." Something moved in his chest, an emotion so intense it almost hurt. Adrian felt his eyes well up. "You already have," he replied softly, holding Emily's small hand across the table. "You taught me what it means to have a family." Emily tilted her head, curious about the emotion in his voice. Anne looked at Adrian, her own eyes moist, a silent understanding passing between them. Adrian took a deep breath, knowing the time had come to say something that had been growing inside him for months. He looked at Anne, then at Emily, and finally at Thomas, who was now watching him with big, attentive eyes, as if he sensed the importance of the moment. "I was a cold man," Adrian began, his voice low but firm. "I didn't know how to care. I spent my days working, accumulating money, buying things, but I would come home to an empty house. I didn't know what I was missing." He paused, swallowing the lump that was forming in his throat. "But you changed that. I'm better because of you. Better as a person, as a man." He hesitated, searching for the right words. I don't know how to live without you anymore." Anne reached her hand across the table, taking his. Her eyes conveyed everything words couldn't express. "We don't either," she replied simply. Emily got up from her chair and ran to hug Adrian. He picked her up, feeling her little arms around his neck, the smell of honey and children's shampoo. "Are we a real family now?" Emily asked against his shoulder. "Yes," Adrian replied, looking at Anne over the girl's head. "That we are a real family." Thomas banged happily on his tray as if applauding, making everyone laugh. In that instant, sitting in his sunny kitchen with Emily on his lap, Thomas drumming happily, and Anne looking at him with a smile that said everything, Adrian Blake understood that he had found something money could never buy. A real home. It wasn't the mansion with its immaculate gardens and luxurious rooms. Home was in Emily's laughter, in Thomas's uncertain steps, in Anne's knowing glance. It was in the imperfect Sunday pancakes, The drawings hanging on the fridge, the conversations at night after the children were asleep. A cold, lonely businessman had found a desperate girl holding her baby brother. An impulsive act of help had turned into the greatest gift Adrian had ever received, a family. And as he hugged Emily and held Anne's hand across the table, Adrian knew, with absolute certainty, that he was finally home. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.